Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I pastor a church in Indianapolis, Indiana called Northwood Christian Church. And while I'm mentioning it, I should apologize for the noise outside of my church and inside of my church. School is back in session, and so we've got our school agers here and our preschoolers here and just all the kids. And so things are getting a bit rowdy. So apologize for any background noise that you may hear, basketball bouncing and some screams, some shouts. Just the sound of children playing. But anyway, that aside, welcome to the Northwood Podcast. We hope that you are well. Before we dive in, I'd like to take a moment to ask you to pause this podcast or video and then like, subscribe, or follow us. If you're watching on YouTube, this means subscribe. Or if you're listening on Spotify, I think you should click follow, if my memory serves me correct. Whatever the case, if you do this, you will be notified every time we post a new episode or video. Also, we encourage you to like our video or even leave a comment. All of these points of engagement really help us out and help the internet's algorithms decide to bring more people to our content. So please, if you can't like, subscribe, follow us, leave a comment, whichever makes the most sense for you. Maybe all of those things. Moving on, we'd like to thank our producer at the All Indiana Podcast Network. I'm not sure if he wants me to mention him by name, so I won't, but we are grateful for him and everyone at the All Indiana Podcast Network and at Wish TV. If you want to learn more about what other podcasts they produce, you should check out their website at www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's www.wishtv.com/podcasts. If you're new here, and I'd like to think that we occasionally garner new listeners. As I was saying, if you're new here, welcome. We at Northwood Christian Church want you to know more about our values and our convictions. And the best way for you to do this would be for us to get to know you better. So please reach out to us and make yourself acquainted. Perhaps we'll become friends. My email is heath@indncc.org. That's my name, HEATH @indncc.org. Or you may check out our website at www.indncc.org. That's INDYNCC.org. Now, we are about to read a passage from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14. But before we do, we need to pause for some ads for our podcast audience. So we'll find you after this pause. And we're back. As I was saying, we're going to read from a passage from Matthew chapter 14, more specifically Matthew 14 verses 22 through 33. That's Matthew 14 verses 22 through 33, and it goes. Immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came forward toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This story is a very watery and windy sort of story. Could you feel the ocean spray as the waves crashed over the disciples again and again? Could you picture it? Life sometimes is that way, caught in the storms, in the water that is necessary for life, but sometimes it can be a very destructive force. Recently, my family and I went to Turkey Run State Park. If you haven't been, you ought to go. It's here in Indiana, in case you wonder. Anyway, at that park, my children can see the destructive power of water on full display. Many of the trails that we walk run through deep ravines cut into solid rock by running water over the course of millions of years. But still, it's water. And I don't think that my children can at this point comprehend the destructive force that water can be, but they'll learn. Flash floods, tsunamis, driving rains, all of these are examples of water that can bring destruction. Sailors, ancient and modern, often have a respect for the oceans that they navigate. They understand just how tenuous their situation is on the ocean. But with the walls of their vessel to separate them from the powerful, untamable sea, maybe they have a little bit less to worry about, but still terrifying. And my children, they are beginning to understand. They have begun to appreciate the dangers of water more recently as they've grown up a bit. But when they were little, very little, they hardly noticed the danger. That's why we had to watch them when they were tottering around the pool, because we knew that they had yet to discover that waters can bring death as well as life. I don't mean to be too dramatic, but it's true. It's a truth that came home to each of my children in turn as they grew older. Perhaps a scary moment when they could not, but for just a moment, touch the bottom of the pool taught them what we adults know. Nobody, not one of us, is in control. Waters in nature are seldom contained, as in a pool, say. And even water in a pool will eventually wear through the walls or evaporate to go to some other place. As for the disciples in today's story, they were raised in a culture that feared the waters. At least they had a deep fear of the ocean. It's ironic, really, that they didn't overcome this fear, for they were situated just off the Mediterranean Sea. Other nations had learned how to navigate these waters that were occasionally troubled, so that they might trade with other coastal towns and cities. And this could have been a great incentive for the Israelites to build a navy or a fleet of commercial ships. But you don't read about that in the Bible. Nothing doing. Instead, the sea became a metaphor for everything that was chaotic and unpredictable in our world. For Jesus' community, the mighty ocean was a powerful reminder that there were forces unleashed in the world, forces they could not control, that may destroy them. Or if not destroy them, wear them down slowly as if they were at the bottom of some deep canyon, or were in fact the deep canyon being worn down, or a sheer cliffside with water cutting in as it flows. Wears you down, life does. Well, here's an example from the very scriptures that the disciples knew of the sort of mental image Jesus' community held of the ocean. This passage I'm about to read is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 17, verse 12. It goes, "Woe, the thunder of many peoples. They thunder like the thundering of the sea. The roar of nations. They roar like the roaring of mighty waters." The writer there expresses what the people feel. They feel the danger around them in the form of the various warring tribes and peoples that surround them, as unpredictable and uncontrollable as the roaring sea. An attack may be experienced as a wave, a conquest from one of those nations as a hurricane. These are powerful metaphors, which is what makes the ocean, the wind, the waves, everything that goes with it. Very apt metaphors for the dangers that we face in the world. Dangers that we cannot control or, in many instances, even prepare for. But God has mastery over these troubled waters. Most often, when the ocean is mentioned in the Bible as a metaphor, it is only referenced to note how God is ultimately in control of it. Even over the chaos in our lives, God remains over it, treading those waters with ease. And so we do not need to fear. God will not let these waters consume us. Or take it from the psalmist, who writes, quote, "The water stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they flee. At the sound of your thunder they take to flight. They rose up to the mountains, ran down to the valleys, to the place that you appointed them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth." That's from Psalm 104, verses 6 through 9. And the "they" mentioned there is the waters. And God contains the ocean and directs the currents and the flow of even the streams, maintaining control over the chaos of our world. As the psalmist continues, we read about how God redirects destructive waters toward life-giving streams and channels. And there's a whole sermon right there, but for now, suffice it to say, in the minds of the Hebrew prophets, the same God we read about in Genesis 1, who hovered over the chaotic waters in the beginning and then called order and life from them, still maintained control over it all. Or, to put it more simply, I'll quote another psalm. Quote, "When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The very deep trembled." It's like God is caught in a staring contest with the ocean and sent the entire ocean packing. And so, God's people will occasionally cry out to this God for help. Or, to quote still another psalm, quote, "Rescue me from the sinking mire. Let me be delivered from my enemies and from the deep waters. Do not let the flood sweep over me, or the deep swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me." That's from Psalm 69, verses 14 and 15. And it's as if to say, God, if you are really master of the storm, give us a little help. Now, keep this in mind, this concept of the ocean, as we return to our story. Because remember, this all started when we read a story about the disciples in a boat, in the sea, in a violent storm. The disciples are caught in the middle of a place that has served as a metaphor for what destroys their very lives. Those stories from their Bible about the sea representing chaos, well, they're in it. They sit in a boat surrounded by a metaphorical snapshot image of their own community's experiences. Crashing waves, relentless wind, the Roman Empire wearing them down, down, down. Like the waters that cut the Grand Canyon, except there's no beauty here. Just ugly greed that breaks way to violence and then to poverty. It is in this context that the disciples are in when they see Jesus, but then they see Jesus, and Jesus is walking on the water that represents the chaos in their lives. The disciples see in Jesus their scriptures come alive. They're scriptures that told of God's ability to contain the waters and even to redirect them. Jesus calms the waters by his presence and then tramples them underfoot. The disciples cannot believe what they are seeing. They have become used to the idea that there may be no hope for them, no one who can calm these troubled waters. They believe they are seeing a ghost at first. That unbelievable. Believing they are seeing a ghost. They cannot trust this help that has arrived. They find some other explanation for it because they do not believe they can trust this help that has arrived. Because there are many false promises in the world. But Jesus offers no false promises, but Jesus speaks through the storm, the wind, and the rain. Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. Then what begins next puts me right into the water myself. I'm speaking here of this back and forth between Jesus and Peter, where Peter tells Jesus, If it is you, call me out into the waters. It's as if to say, I want to trust you. I just need some assurances. And the reason I say that puts me into the water is because it makes me recall to mind those moments when I myself stood in waters that seemed to my children to be very troubled. There's me in the pool, and then there's one of my kids with their floaties off this time, and I'm saying to them, come on in. I'm right here. I won't let you sink. I'll hold you in the water. Just trust me. Jump on in. And I know that I'm good for it. I know that I will not let them fail. I may not be able to contain oceans, but I can manage the pool at the YMCA after all. But there have been moments when I've been persuasive enough to goad one of my kids into the water. And in those moments, reluctantly perhaps, they let themselves down into the water and into my arms. And here they begin to calm down. I hold them in the water to teach them that with me here, they are safe. What's more, I want them to understand that someday they will have mastery over these waters themselves. They'll be swimming laps in the pool with all their friends. So right now we're in swimming lessons with that in mind. And the first thing on the agenda, learn to tread water. Because if you can tread water, you can at least breathe. It may not be the best option. Perhaps a breaststroke would serve you better, and perhaps my kids will learn to do that or freestyle swim or something better. But now treading on water may be the best that they can do, maybe the best you can do, or at least treading water can be enough to keep you alive. I'm sure you can relate to the plight of the disciples either way, especially of Peter. Now, before that tangent about my kids and the swimming, we left Peter on the edge of the waters wondering if he should take the leap into them to discover if Jesus can really keep him safe from the storm. And he takes the plunge, but then can't even seem to tread water. We don't know how deep he sank. Perhaps he did tread water, but either way, he felt lost. We are given the impression that at first things seem to be fine until he notices the wind and the waves. He is so captivated by this danger that he loses grip on his confidence. He had a little faith at first. This got him out of the boat, but he could not master the waters alone. And it turns out that's okay. Jesus is still there, meeting him where he is at. And this is grace. And he extends him, he being Jesus, extends Peter his hand and seems to chide him for his little faith. However, I will remind you that just 3 chapters later, in Matthew chapter 17, we read how faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains. So perhaps Jesus is saying, why do you have little faith? Why do you doubt? Could be to acknowledge that you had just enough. Perhaps Peter has more faith than us all. I mean, I never stepped out of a boat onto the ocean. I have, however, at certain times of my life, felt as if I were on the edge of some precipice, some grand decision about life, a leap of faith required. It was such a leap that brought me to Indianapolis, to this church in the first place. But even now, I feel as though I am just on the edge of many boats and that Jesus is calling me out and away from my fears, my insecurities, and my apathy, to dive into works and projects that might make this world a better place and perhaps calm the troubled waters of our times. And maybe you feel the same. But Peter took the leap, and true to life, it didn't turn out exactly as he hoped. In moments, he began to sink. His fear returned, his faith waned, but he did not drown. Notice that. Jesus was good for it. He kept him safe from the worst that the sea could send Peter's way. Despite his little faith, it was enough. Treading water is not ideal, but sometimes it is all you can do, and often it is enough. The story concludes with the disciples looking to Jesus in amazement. And here, I'll just read it for you again, starting in verse 32 of Matthew chapter 14. Quote, "When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" That is to say, Truly, you are the image of that God we read about in our scriptures, who set boundaries to the ocean and directed the waters where they would go. In short, they saw that Jesus possessed a power in God to bring a calm to the chaos in their lives. This is a power that God has, and so they are amazed. And they would remember this story again going forward. It would be told and retold over time and in many contexts. And here we are right now talking about it today. Whenever the metaphorical waters rose in the lives of the disciples, they would recall stories like this and how Jesus had mastery over the forces actively tearing the world apart. And in this case, over the wind and the waves that symbolize chaos and destruction, even over their own circumstances that were like the wild ocean. Tread water, then help arrives. And where is this help today? Because the waters are still rough out there. Things have changed, but also remain the same. You know what I mean? Wars, violence, poverty, hunger, now climate catastrophes at a frequency the human race has seldom experienced before, if ever. I could paint you many pictures of many storms that threaten to push us underwater today. And where is the help? Ultimately, we believe that God is sovereign. That's just a churchy way of saying that God is not overwhelmed by our world's chaos and is holding it and will eventually bring us calm waters. However, in the meantime, where is the help? Body of Christ, where? Oh, wait. There it is. Body of Christ. That's us and the disciples. And the disciples learned from Jesus how to be present for people in the midst of their own personal storms. They embedded themselves in communities to learn firsthand of the struggles in those communities. Then they brought with them whatever help they could afford. Read about their story in the book of Acts, or in the epistles you can read similar things. They followed Peter's example and took the leap into the unknown, the troubled waters, to discover not only did they not drown, they did more than tread water. And that they discovered that they too could offer help to struggling people. Today, we Christians are called to serve as the help in the midst of these storms. We are called to be the hands that reach down into the waters to help others do more than just tread water. We want to see all people swim. And not only swim, but then discover that they too can be a life raft. Or perhaps a piece of driftwood that just keeps another afloat for as long as is necessary. Just enough. My kids have each found a way into the water. After many moments where they found themselves on the edge of the pool, afraid to jump in, eventually they made it into the waters where I held them. Then, with more than a little help of the YMCA swimming teachers, almost the exclusive help of the YMCA swimming teachers, my children learned how to swim for themselves, and now they can help their friends navigate the waters, the sometimes troubled waters. And someday they will teach others to swim. And this fits the pattern, doesn't it? The pattern we see in the scriptures and in our own stories. God calls order from the chaotic waters of our troubled world and calls us into the troubled waters where we fight the wind and the waves with God and with God's help. And we have all the help we need as we learn how to swim to navigate our world's troubled waters. Eventually, we find that God has given us the strength to tread water and then some. And now we can help others navigate these waters. We can be, as Jesus was for Peter, a helping hand in the storm. So how are you? Treading water? Worse? Better? Or have you mastered the waters of life? Assuming you haven't, join the rest of us and hold on to hope. Help will come. In the book of Revelation, John the Revelator envisions an end to the storms. There you can read of a God presiding over a glassy sea, a still ocean. Remember that the sea serves as a metaphor for the storms of life, scary and cruel, but here in the end that John the Revelator envisions, God has smoothed over the waves and has brought about a calm so complete that the sea looks like glass. But then, until then, hold on. Tread water as best you can. Help will come. But if you've begun to find your sea legs, perhaps you find yourself in a circumstance similar to the disciples after Jesus left them. They discovered then that they themselves had not only some mastery over life's destructive forces, but also the ability to help others who are struggling in these waters. So they helped everyone they could. The church grew, and the rest is history. And now here we are, the hands and the feet of Jesus in the 21st century. So where might you find where your help is needed? Really shouldn't be too hard to find. The world is filled with storms. The storms are too numerous, and the water's too high to even sometimes contemplate. Millions in America and billions worldwide are struggling in one way or another. Some are near drowning. Can you help? Can you bring a little calm into the storm? Or will they continue to tread water? This story is a call to action. So I will say with the words of Jesus that he spoke to Peter, words to you and to me. Church of Christ, get yourself out of the boat and into these troubled waters. A helping hand to those who fear drowning. Church of Christ, get yourself out of the boat.